Good evening to all of you who are present, and thank you so much for being here this evening in celebration of the 75th anniversary of Illinois Council for Exceptional Children. On the 15th day of each month, we stop to consider foundational information that matters to us in our field as we begin the next 75 years in Illinois CEC. 1 hour of professional development credit is available for this session. This evening, it is my joy to welcome Kara Kennedy and her presentation on teaching content and literacy to students with disabilities using literacy across disciplines. Kara is a doctoral candidate at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb. This is Kara's 17th year teaching. She taught in high school for 16 years and 1 year at the elementary level. She began her career with a BA degree in English education from Illinois State University. While teaching, she continued her studies. She has graduate degrees in literacy and special education from DePaul University and an endorsement in ESL from Dominican University. Kara is currently pursuing an EDD in curriculum and instruction literacy. She is passionate about her studies on the intersection of digital and disciplinary literacies and how that can apply to diverse populations. Once again, it is absolutely my joy to introduce to you Kara Kennedy, future Dr. Kara Kennedy, and it will not be long, Kara, teaching content and literacy. And you have a superb topic and onwards for you.
Thanks so much. So this presentation will be all about disciplinary literacy. I encourage you all to jump in. I prefer more of a conversational presentation, so please unmute yourselves and jump in whenever. I did put the link to the presentation in the chat, and this QR code will bring you there too. So a lot of times in education, we hear all these different terms being thrown around. Disciplinary literacy, content area literacy, science of reading, most recently, evidence-based practice, reading strategies. What's the difference? Has anybody ever heard any of these terms? What's your experience with them?
See and tell. Good. Jump in, please.
Yeah, well, evidence-based practice is, of course, super important when we make any of our decisions clinically or educationally. And I know we've been practicing all sorts of reading strategies, but I am interested to know more about specifically the science of reading, since that's a little bit outside my usual scope.
So I think science of reading is the first time I heard it was the media actually was not research. It was the podcast Sold a Story from APM Reports, I think it was. And I, I may be wrong, but I thought that's where that term originated from and grew out of media hype of, hey, we're teaching literacy wrong. We need to teach it according to evidence-based practice. So I think that's where that came from. As far as research goes, most researchers I've read will be more specific than that, unless they're studying like how the media is spinning reading and research. Content area literacy was very popular in the 90s and 2000s. Disciplinary literacy in the research world, a lot of those pieces came late 90s, early 2000s. One of the biggest that I cite the most one of the most original would be Shanahan and Shanahan 2008. They talked about disciplinary literacy and how that's different than content area literacy, and I'll get into that more. Reading strategies is more of a general term to talk about any strategy that people are using to understand what they're reading. Okay. So it can be a lot of different things. A lot of these terms have a lot of crossover. So it depends on who you're reading and what they're deciding to call it. What experiences have you had with literacy before I get too far into this?
I would say I've had a lot with teaching literacy, but I've just started working with programs across our university. So the math folks, the science folks, the social science folks, and hearing and talking a lot more about disciplinary literacy and disciplinary literacy versus content area literacy. That's been a huge conversation. And our candidates all, regardless of which program of those secondary programs, take a pair of courses that's supposed to be a little more generic, I guess. And so lots of conversations trying to craft those courses and make revisions so that we're not overstepping the disciplines, but we're providing something that spans all the disciplines, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes. And that's where content area literacy kind of comes in. Content area literacy is a general set of strategies that can apply to any discipline and any reading that you come to, any reading, writing, and thinking. Disciplinary literacy is a different approach to using literacy as a tool to help kids understand disciplinary knowledge. And so certain strategies may be emphasized or de-emphasized based on what discipline you're working with. And so I'm going to start just by kind of doing a quick overview of the research. So on the right, this is a graphic that I came up with that helps me understand what is disciplinary literacy. It's really similar to if you've ever looked at the RAND model of reading comprehension, that's kind of what it's based off of. But for disciplinary literacy, it's basically the idea that we are using literacy as a tool to gain content knowledge. So if I want students in my biology class able to write a conclusion for a lab that we did, what literacy strategy am I helping them with in order to get them there? Am I doing a read aloud? Am I doing a write aloud? Am I showing them the CER framework, the claim evidence reasoning, to writing an argument if that's where I want them to go with it? And so I'm going to help them get that content knowledge by giving them strategies to use. And that applies to reading, writing, discourse, both oral and written, and everything in between. And then thinking as well. It's specific to a discipline like English, math, science, social studies, even your more elective courses like art, culinary sciences, woodworking. Disciplinary literacy is absolutely applicable there too. So it's not just a core content area. And there's really three main facets of disciplinary literacy in the research. To start with is the epistemological beliefs. One of the key research pieces here would be Elizabeth Bermoji, 2007. She talks about literacy as a tool to create more equitable learning experiences for students. Both students diverse ability-wise, culture-wise, language-wise, to help students understand what are the beliefs of a specific discipline. what's prioritized there? And how do we get kids to knowledge creation, creating their own knowledge, creating their own learning versus consuming knowledge, and just memorizing names, dates, and places, right? Disciplinary literacy focuses more on getting kids to that knowledge creation. Right? Habits of Thinking and Practice comes from Shanahan and Shanahan 2008. They talked about habits of thinking in terms of what specific strategies do disciplinary experts use in order to read, write, and think. So they talk a lot about cognitive strategies. These are a lot of your expert novice studies where the researcher would go in and have experts read a disciplinary text, like in English, maybe it's a poem. And the experts are using X reading strategies as measured by read alouds as they read versus novices aren't using those strategies, right? And that's how that then informs instruction to say, hey, if the experts are using these practices and strategies, we should teach students how to use those as well. Wickens et al. 2016 was much later. They talked about expanding that beyond cognitive strategies to also include practices. So disciplines like art, culinary sciences, woodworking, you may not have a ton of written text, but you do have a lot of disciplinary practices. Like in culinary sciences, when you're making a recipe, there are certain practices you engage in the kitchen. Cleanliness, for example, making sure your surfaces are clean, making sure you're cleaning up after yourself. Those are habits of practice that experts in the restaurant business would then engage in. Okay? So including that in the disciplinary literacy approach as well. And then language use. That goes beyond just memorizing disciplinary specific vocabulary words, and seeing how does that discipline use language in order to create knowledge, right? That could include sentence structure. That could include differences of phrasing and how they would say things different to other areas, right? You see that a lot with argumentation. A lot of disciplines use arguments, whereas in history, we would call it historical interpretation. In English, we would call it literary analysis. In science, we'd call it CER, claim evidence reasoning. But really, the content area literacy practice, the general one that would align with is argumentation. Here's what I'm going to argue. Here's my evidence to prove it. Here's my explanation. Here's my opinion. All of it kind of narrows down to that, but in the disciplines, that's where it diverges, because in English, we don't just explain in the end, we analyze, pull apart those quotes that you're using. How is the author creating meaning there? What literary tools is the author using as they're writing? And so that's kind of an example of language use. But all of this is centered in a specific disciplinary context, right? Because each discipline uses literacy slightly differently. Right? And I'm just going to go over a couple different examples. So in English, this is what I've taught the most. So a lot of my examples tonight have to do with English, just because that's what I know the best. An example of one of the epistemological beliefs would be literature is a reflection of the human experience. And so when we're having students read text and write about it, what are some of those habits of thinking and practice we want to instill in them? Creating an interpretation. That comes from a lot of expert novice studies of when experts are reading, everything they're thinking about has to do with that interpretation. So as they're reading, does this confirm my interpretation? Can I extend my interpretation from here? Do I need to change it? Because this doesn't align with my original interpretation that I was thinking of. Literary reasoning is the literary analysis. A lot of the research calls it literary reasoning. Literary argumentation would be the writing that students engage in. So my claim would be, here's my interpretation of a text, here's the evidence that supports it, then here's my analysis of it, right? Inferencing is a big cognitive strategy in English. Language use, some of those specific literary devices like personification, onomatopoeia, that's language specific to English and literature that you're not going to see in other disciplines. Literary analysis writing. So when you're writing in English, we would call that third section where students are giving their opinion, we'd call that analysis. Other disciplines might call it reasoning, right? As well as using language as I write to describe ideas, to describe setting. That's very much an English use of language. History and social studies is another discipline, founded on the belief that history is an interpretation. History is arguable. There isn't really set in stone there. Three big cognitive strategies that you would come across in history is contextualizing. So when you have a text, where did that come from? When was it written? Who wrote it? What circumstances was it written under? Sourcing is similar to that. What's the source of, or the origins of that text? Who wrote it? What do we know about them? What information? Where were they in history compared to the event that we're studying? And then synthesis across multiple texts, looking at how do you put together information from multiple texts to come up with some sort of historical interpretation. Right? Language use in history, using language to show time period, as well as reading for time period vocabulary. Science, epistemological beliefs that we use data to understand the world around us. Habits of thinking, cross-referencing charts and writing. So some of the expert novice studies talked about how when expert scientists read text, their eyes are going from the chart to the written text to try to cross-reference and figure out how those align and using them to understand the other. Argumentation in science is referred to as CER, claim evidence reasoning, whereas that reasoning in English is often called analysis or sometimes elaboration. It's in science also is the idea of inductive versus deductive reasoning, and how I'm going from data to theory and not the other way around. Right? Whereas other disciplines, it may be a very different approach. Okay. One of the big aspects of language use in science is precision of language, being very precise to exactly what you're trying to describe in that scientific area. But like I alluded to before, this isn't specific to the core academic disciplines that we talk about at the high school level. You can still look at disciplinary literacy in art or in culinary or in woodworking, really any discipline out there. They have beliefs. There are habits of thinking or practice, right? PE is a really good example of that. There are aspects and practices of physical education, how to be physically fit, exercising every day. That is a habit in that discipline. How they use language to describe exercise. So I wanted to pause here and open up the floor for a little discussion. How can literacy help students with disabilities in these disciplines?
Well, I know I personally focus a lot, especially on like those foundational practices and language use, especially like those tier 2 vocabulary words that really branch the different kind of classes. So what we learn in our English class that can also be used in our science classes and our history classes or other classes, and just foundational practices of like going back to find our evidence, going back to check, going like thinking about what we're reading is also something that we work really, really hard on. That's difficult for many of my students. So that's definitely something that crosses the discipline boundaries.
Paula, Missy, any thoughts?
Yeah, many thoughts indeed, Karen. I don't want to, talk too much. I remember a great story, one of my colleagues at ISU some many years ago when she was teaching in a high school environment, and she was landed into a high school classroom on physics. And dear Peggy had absolutely no idea what was going on in the physics class. It was completely not her stuff. But she was so helpful to the student that she was working on. She's a teacher of children with learning disabilities, but she tells a magnificent story of how she was able to diagram and like she knew how to build this student's understanding of the physics by the mechanics of basically comprehension, and drawing diagrams and flow charts and just making it real for the student. Even he wound up knowing more about the physics than Peggy did, which is exactly, related to what you're talking about here, like how, and even Tama, to the whole notion of awareness building, for students to be thinking about, let me go back and check the title of this thing again. Let me see the little summary at the side of maybe, so what exactly, just really tuning in and really being aware. It's just a wonderfully exciting work. And Peggy's, how would you reflect on Peggy's physics and basically she gave him the tools, but she really didn't understand it herself.
So, one of my former colleagues at Leiden, her dissertation is in using disciplinary literacy to coach other teachers, Paula Di Domenico. And you don't have to be an expert in physics. You don't have to be an expert in the content knowledge. But if you're an expert in disciplinary literacy, then you can help teachers by giving them the tools to help their students and coaching teachers through those tools. Your story about Peggy reminds me of my own experience teaching science. Because, like you said, my degrees are in English and literacy. That's as far away from science as you can get. But it was like 3 or 4 years ago that my sped department chair was like, oh, by the way, you're teaching biology next year. I was like, what? What?
Oh,
Is this an April Fool's joke?
oh,
What's going on? And just the way the section shook out, and it is what it is. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm teaching disciplinary literacy because that's all I got. And so I taught biology. I can say I taught it. And similar to what Peggy did, I started with literacy as a tool. What literary tools and comprehension strategies can I give you to help you understand the text, the writing, the reasoning through scientific approaches. Any other thoughts before I move on to examples?
I'm sure Missy's situation, trying to decide what to put in coursework would be very interesting.
Well, our I will say our PE folks do not think literacy applies to them whatsoever. That I was glad you said the word, the term PE, because that has been a whole, their students will still have to take these generic courses. But the students don't think it applies to them, and really the faculty don't think it applies to them in kinesthesiology and sports recreation or whatever it's called. But I was
So
just,
this article may help you, Missy,
oh, please.
because Wickens et al. 2016 was co-authored by Corinne Wickens and Mike Mandarino, who are both literacy people and two PE faculty. And it's all about how literacy is in PE.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, they do have a specific course at NIU, like the content area literacy course you're talking about, but it is only for PE majors. They have a specific section because they teach it a little differently.
But do they also have a disciplinary literacy course?
Disciplinary literacy is embedded in the content area
Like in their methods or
course.
something?
Yeah, they
Okay.
do content and discipline, I believe. Corinne's the program coordinator. She would know more than me, but they do have a very specific way. I know that they teach it for PE majors because of that exact reason, like you said.
That's
Literacy
interesting. We might
is,
want to contact somebody.
yeah, Corinne Wicken, she's awesome. Hands
Thank you.
down, one of my favorite people.
Appreciate
Corinne, yeah. That 2016 piece appeared in Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. So disciplinary literacy is a framework. It applies to all aspects of literacy within a specific discipline: reading, writing, discourse, thinking. It's not a checklist that you go through. It's not a worksheet that you can say, hey, look, here's a worksheet I created. Look, I'm doing disciplinary literacy. It's an approach to when you teach a content saying, okay, here's my content goal, and now here's the literacy tool I'm going to give kids in order to help them reach that goal. My other favorite topic is multimodality, and I always try to touch on this because the disciplines are naturally multimodal in that there isn't just written text. In PE, you get a lot of text from gesturing, and moving around. In English language arts, film, song, even artwork to some degree in English and history, those are all texts that carry messages, carry meaning, that are then used to inform disciplinary knowledge. Images, drawings, and especially political cartoons in history, tons of meaning and information in those. Charts and graphs in science, those are texts in and of themselves. And special considerations for those texts with students in how are we directly instructing kids on how to engage with those text types? Like just this past Friday, I used a video of a story. And before I started, I said, hey guys, when I'm listening to a story being told to me out loud, how do I know what it means? How do I pick up on what's going on there? And they were able to throw out ideas like, well, the words they use, but also how they say things, tone of voice, and directly instructing kids on how to read those kind of texts. Graphic novels are a great example of this. I'm thinking back to 2 or 3 years ago when I was teaching freshman English, and I was talking to one of the sped teachers, and she was like, oh, yeah, I switched out To Kill a Mockingbird for the graphic version, and I'm kind of surprised that kids aren't understanding it that well. I thought it would be easier. And in talking to her, we realized that she never taught them how to read a graphic novel. Graphic novels, a lot of times, are significantly shorter than the written version. Why? Because a lot of those words that would normally be spoken or written out are in the drawings. So if kids aren't reading the drawing and reading the artwork and even the borders and the use of colors and lines, kids have to read that in order to fully understand the text and the symbolism of those texts. Otherwise, they're going to miss meaning in it, right? So directly instructing with multimodality. Has anybody ever used multimodal texts in the classroom?
I'm currently reading a graphic novel with one of my classes, and as we go through it, we look at all the pictures of like how are people thinking and feeling? How can we tell when they have memories? You can tell that the boxes are squiggly, so it reminds us to think it's not in the present. So yeah.
Yeah. And that goes back to what I was saying with directly instructing kids. That's a great example of that. Because otherwise, I'm sure students would have read right through that and not understood that it was a memory. Other thoughts? So here are some examples. Most of these are things that I've done in the classroom. So this is for English language arts. If you're looking at characterization, this is a chart I've used. Give me an adjective or a character trait. How does the writer create that? Do they directly state it? Is it in the dialogue, things that the character says, what they say they're thinking, quotes, that's the evidence, and then connecting that to an interpretation. And so, how is this disciplinary literacy? Well, that analyzing the character and making the inferences, that's your habits of thinking and practice. The idea that characters contribute meaning or theme to a story is part of the epistemology of English. Identifying those parts of the text that are meaningful, connecting them to some sort of interpretation or meaning that the student gives to the story. That's all disciplinary literacy. And this is a standard chart I use for most of the texts, most of the novels that I teach for English. But it's disciplinary in that I wouldn't use this with a history class because the character traits really aren't as important in history, or even a science lesson would make no sense, right? And so that's how it's specific to English language arts. This is for a specific text set. So one of the units we did in freshman English was epic poetry, and I chose Beowulf as the epic poem. So this links to the original text. This is a novel. This is the graphic novel version, actually two different versions. I prefer the Stern, Steininger, and Studebaker version. Hines is a really great graphic novelist, but for this specific one, it was a lot of written words in the original, like Seamus Heaney translation of the Old English. And so for my purposes, I wanted them to have more of a visual representation of it, which the Stern version, it looks a lot like a superhero comic, but it happens to be Beowulf. And so my students were able to see that and then connect it to that prior knowledge of reading about comic book heroes, right? And then I also used the 2007 movie version of it. Their final assessment for this unit was a multimodal argument about heroes. and they had to use WeVideo to pair up 15 to 20 images and music and minimal words. Like the most words per slide they could use, I think, was 3 to 5. So it was mostly supposed to be a combination of that image, music, and word to unpack the question of what is a hero? How has that conception of hero changed from Beowulf's time to ours? Right. And so these were the requirements of it. And then they had to write a short paragraph explaining their decisions. Why did they pick those images? What was that music supposed to represent? Right? What mood and tone did it set? And so the disciplinary literacy here is synthesis, looking across multiple versions of the same text to see commonalities, themes among that, and how different people interpret those different texts, right? Because each of those really is an interpretation. Even though Seamus Heaney is translating it, there's an interpretation there in the words he chooses to use in that translation. The movie and what they choose to transpose onto the screen, that's an interpretation of that text, as well as the graphic novel, what's present, what's not, what do they change, and what's not. Gareth Hines did a really good graphic novel version of Romeo and Juliet, but he changed the characters to be multicultural, which puts a really cool spin on the text in Shakespeare's original. In this, some of the epistemological beliefs you see are cultural values in a literary text, language use, listing the different character traits that I talked about earlier, all of that. So this is when I taught biology. This comes from the website Calling Bullshit. Has anybody ever heard of that? No? Okay. If you're ever looking for a good laugh, check it out. It's really cool, especially if you ever teach credibility, because it is a college biology instructor that video recorded a lot of his lessons on data literacy and how numbers don't lie, but people lie, and people use data to spin the truth and misinterpreting data. And so this was the introductory unit on scientific method, and I did a lesson using that, and credibility is a general idea. That's a content area literacy strategy. But in biology, what does credibility look like? Well, it's from looking in depth at those numbers and how do those numbers really represent the claims that you're saying that they back. And so what makes something credible in science? This specific activity asks them to use strategies like questioning and determining importance. Both of those are very scientific skills and strategies that they would be asked to use in that discipline. I've never taught history. I would say that's the only core subject that I have never taught. So Mike Mandarino is my chair for my dissertation, and this comes from his dissertation. He did disciplinary literacy in history. And so looking at historical texts and across those texts, how do students synthesize, was President Johnson justified in asking Congress for resolution for war after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents? And this brings in histories and arguments and introducing students to that belief. Asking students to engage in contextualizing and sourcing with the reading of those multimodal texts. Considerations for diverse learners. So I've worked with both students with disabilities and multilingual learners. For students with disabilities, some of the specific strategies I use are directly instructing and identifying the strategies I want them to use. I do a lot of read aloud, think aloud, as well as write aloud, think aloud. So if I'm going to have them write a prompt, I will start by writing it first out loud with them and show them how I make mistakes as I write. And I'll do a cold write and show them, oh, I really don't like how that sounds. Let me redo that. Let me rearrange this, fix that. Oh, no, that doesn't align with this. So that they can see some of the strategies that I'm using as a learner. Directly teaching some of the beliefs of the disciplines. Like in English, understanding that everything we do should focus around your interpretation of that literary text and how you're bringing those different literary texts together, right? If we're using a text set, okay? But as well as helping students connect to some of the other disciplines. So like I was talking about with argumentation, when students move from, say, science to history to English, helping them understand that all three of those writing structures are really similar. You could use the same graphic organizer. It's a content area literacy thing, but the way I use language is unique to the discipline I'm in. For multilingual learners, focusing a lot on language use and background knowledge and how whatever text or writing or discourse I'm asking them to engage in, what language do they need to know ahead of time? I have a set of academic discourse cards that I'll pass out to students that are like friendly disagreement, extend an idea, make a claim, ask a question, bring somebody else into the discussion. And I will sometimes pass those out and explain the language use of them with like, hey, in literary analysis, we can disagree with each other. It's a good thing to have productive disagreement. And those cards then give kids the opportunity to engage in that practice because one of the ways I use them is say, okay, whatever card you have in front of you, you have to use that at one point during your discussion, right? Otherwise, what I find is, especially in English, if I'm saying, hey, let's talk about Beowulf, right? They're like, yep, I agree, I agree, I agree. And we never diverge from that path. So, using those discourse cards to help kids and support their use of language as we engage in discourse. And these are just different examples of texts that you would find in each discipline, right? Right. We're kind of running short on time, so I'm just going to leave this up here. If you want to browse through them, those are all different texts that I've used in the past. And these are some different resources. Tim Shanahan he and his wife wrote the Shanahan and Shanahan 2008 piece. And this is a blog version of a lot of the research that I just discussed. And it's a really nice, succinct analysis of it. Michigan Association, this is taking disciplinary literacy and then specific lessons on how do you use that in the classroom in different areas. And it goes through each of the different disciplines, different aspects of the different disciplines. This is another really great resource if you're looking to implement disciplinary literacy into like a specific classroom. Questions? Anything else I can expand on or answer?
Yeah, maybe a quick little word about your own dissertation, Kara. Like, what do you hope to accomplish in your dissertation research?
So I'm hoping to do a mixed method study, convergent mixed method study using three different text sets, one only written, one only multimodal, and one a combination of written and multimodal text sets within English language arts, and looking at how do students process those texts and synthesize across those texts in multimodal composition. So reading, writing, think aloud, using social annotation. Have you guys used social annotation before?
Like
So
Google Docs? Like there would be something in Google Docs where people are all working on it or no?
yeah, yes. So it's like you have the original text that you are asking students to read in Google Docs, and then they're all commenting on that one doc. And so it also becomes like a slow discussion as kids are reading. And so using social annotation of all those different multimodal texts and written texts to hopefully see and investigate how are kids processing multimodal versus written texts. And are they able to engage in disciplinary literacy practices like literary reasoning with multimodal? Is there advantage of one over the other? And so it'll stagger the kids into three different groups so that they read in different orders.
Fascinating. Yes, indeed.
And
Yeah.
hoping to finish at some point in my lifetime.
Oh, yeah. Maybe take a manageable piece, Kara. Your advisor will help you do that because that is a temptation. I'm sure Missy could talk to that for a minute, you know, um, just taking a manageable piece for your dissertation research, but you will do that. Yeah, this is a huge topic. Do we want to make any other comment or question before we close here, Missy or Tama?
I just wanted to thank Kara for presenting and sharing the information with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was interesting. I was thinking a lot about how I need to reach out to some of my other content teachers because I work so closely with the English classes. It'd be great to share some of this information with all those other teachers.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very, very nice. Well, thank you very much, Kara.
Absolutely.
And let me find my pause or stop.